All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, focusing today on what non-Native service providers need to know about working with Indigenous survivors of sexual assault. It's a very long title, but it's a very important topic, and we're really excited to be here with everyone today. Bonjour, my name is Jolene Engelking, and I am the Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Coordinator at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. We are a statewide tribal coalition, but we're here today as part of our national training and technical assistance efforts, including our brand new resource center, which just launched about a month ago, where we're really hoping to expand on the written resources, the webinars, the trainings, the connection, all of those things that will really help to enhance the capacity of folks who are supporting Indigenous survivors, both in tribal communities and outside of tribal bounds, as well as just really dive deeper into what sexual violence looks like as a public health issue in our Indigenous communities. And so I am White Earth Anishinaabe from here in Minnesota, and I am a mother, a daughter, a coffee lover, as you'll see me drinking quite frequently. And I'm also honored to have an amazing colleague with me today. And I'm going to turn it on over to Shayla to introduce herself.
Shayla Beaumont. I'm the Elevate Uplift Coordinator for Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I am an enrolled Chippewa Cree member, and I'm also affiliated with Crow, Gros Ventre, and Assiniboine. Oh my gosh, almost forgot my tribal affiliations.
I know I was going to add that one in for you, but we're very thankful Shayla is with us today coming from, there's a TA provider meeting in DC, and she's taking some time away from that to kind of have this conversation with everyone. And so we really wanted to have this conversation because it's something, you know, in doing direct advocacy that it was difficult to really be thinking about how can tribal programs and other culturally based programs be better supportive of the or how can they be more welcoming or really preparing non-Native survivors who are advocates or other staff within their programs, as well as that intersection of working with the non-tribal or the more mainstream sort of programs. And I know that when I was an advocate, for a chunk of time there, I was working at a community-based advocacy program in a border community where there were 3 different reservations right around us. And we've had to form relationships with, you know, the tribal victim service folks and advocates on each of those reservations with the different dynamics. But there was still always kind of like a slight rub about how, especially as a mainstream program, were we dropping the ball on some things, right? We made many missteps. And even as an Indigenous person, I wasn't always sure how to navigate those situations. And so now with this resource center, we're really wanting to kind of like dive a little bit deeper and have some of these conversations, which aren't new. People have had them before, but really thinking about what can we do, you know, better? What can we do differently? And just truly, I think that both for folks who are non-Native, who are serving an Indigenous community within like tribal lands, as well as for people who are in, you know, in urban settings, rural settings, suburban settings, all these different places, to really be thinking about how are we better able to meet those needs, you know, from providing advocacy services to different healing options, outreach even, support within systems, as well as helping to address the systemic and individual barriers, including racism, that really kind of creates issues for us. So we're not going to have a PowerPoint today, and we really just wanted to have this be a good conversation between Shayla and I. And so I'm going to just kind of lob a question at you, Shayla. So if you were to do like one of those 101 sort of presentations about, you know, what is unique or what is different about sexual violence against Indigenous people? What are some of those key things, just as kind of like a grounding that we should be thinking about?
Yes, thank you, Jolene. A few things definitely to think about when we're providing advocacy to our Indigenous survivors. I would really encourage our advocates to learn the local tribes in your area or even in your surrounding areas. There's a huge misconception that a lot of Indigenous folks live on the reservation when a lot of Indigenous people do live away from the reservation and off in urban cities. So really just understanding the tribes or the reservations around you and the resources available, and even just learning their processes of how they navigate their resources, and also even educating. We talk about Indigenous persons being targeted at high rates for sexual violence, and really educating, like, what does that disproportionate rate mean, and being only 10% of the population but representing over 50% of sexual assault survivors, really educating what that disproportionate rate means and all the factors that influence that. And then also, when we talk about tribes and when we talked about holistic approaches and ways to healing, and really learning how each tribe is very unique in their own way. Their customs are different. The way they carry out their culture practices could be very different. The way they navigate their community could be very different, even in families too. Like, they might belong to the same tribe, but not all families, even though they do belong to the same tribe, they could still have, I don't want to say like different beliefs, but different processes, or maybe just different ways they practice their culture. And really emphasizing to learn that, and how to be transparent, and also learn about not only the cultural side, but also the historical trauma side of things, and really learning the history of historical trauma from, first contact, and really understanding how that really targets Indigenous persons, and how that oppression comes into play, not only for targeted at violence, but also attaining resources and help, and especially educating our communities, and educating people that work in this, everyone, about the historical trauma and what has happened, and really to create that transparency, to really have that understanding.
You've just said so many things that are just making my head go in so many different ways. I think that one of the things, because this right now, we're not going to be doing like a all-encompassing, this is all that you need to know about sexual assault in Indigenous communities. But like, when we're thinking about the fact that there are 574-ish federally recognized tribes, plus so many state recognized tribes, plus so many tribes that are not even recognized in communities, let alone folks that have land versus don't have land, as well as folks who, due to blood quantum, aren't able to be enrolled, or whatever the various tribes like enrollment processes are. There's a lot of folks out there who are Indigenous and identify as Indigenous, but some other people might not count them, right? There's a lot of gatekeeping that can happen when it comes to identity. And I've also been talking with a lot of people, recently, who were caught up in the 60s scoop in Canada, right? Which is, parallels a lot of what happened in the US. But with the forced removal of children from their families, and that disconnection from culture. I think there's also kind of this misconception that, all Native folks are like super spiritual or super traditional, or know all the in jokes and all those sorts of things. And that's not always true. Some folks do, right? But just really recognizing that, the historical trauma is current. I remember when it really hit me, what historical trauma really was I was at an internship when I was in Chicago, and I was talking with one of the volunteers there, and he mentioned, a lot of the abuse that he had went through as a child, right? Grandma who was very, very strict, who would have a lot of like physical ways of disciplining him and all these sorts of things. And then he mentioned, he's like, yeah, but her mom was a slave. And I'm recognizing like that's such a close connection. And I'm like, because in my head, slavery is something that happened so long ago, right? But I'm like, oh, he is living the direct results of slavery today. And that's also impacting how he's raising his own children, right? And so then in terms of our Indigenous communities, I think that a lot of people think it was around, Civil War times, right? That boarding schools and all of that was only back in the day, right? When we're recognizing that, well, boarding schools are still around, today, but really the boarding schools that we think of were still very heavy from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even, right? And so many of us have parents, uncles, grandparents, who that directly impacts how we are living our lives and how we have shaped our beings, right? And some of that's, trauma that has been passed down. Some of it is people who have had to pull away from culture as a protective factor, and other people have leaned into it as a way to help form connections. And so I think that it's this idea that you can't make assumptions. And if we're going to take anything away from our time today, I think the big thing is be curious and be communicative. I think those are just two of the things that I really think will help in all of these issues, as well as then we're also talking about like all of these different tribes out there. Shayla's talking about how many people have lived off reservation. I've seen anywhere between like 80-85% of folks live off of tribal lands, which means that huge amount of survivors that are out there are also likely not able to necessarily access culturally designed services. There are culturally, tribal specific services, outside of reservation land. A lot of urban communities, have advocacy programs or community hubs and things like that as well. But some of them aren't equipped to handle sexual assault as its unique kind of standalone sort of issue. And also sometimes when you're in really small communities, I mean, I live, right outside Minneapolis and St. Paul, both of which have very large urban Indian communities. And even though they're very large, they're very small at the same time. Where if something were to happen, how are we ensuring confidentiality? How are you feeling safe seeing a service provider who you see on a regular basis at whatever sort of, community event, right? And so that's why sometimes people will seek to go to the more mainstream programs, right? Because there's a little bit more anonymity, and there's a little, so you look like you're going to say something, Shayla. But yeah, and so we just kind of want to, the other kind of thing I wanted to really bring up was these jurisdictional complications. And that is not something that we can, even do barely a primer on today. But as I spoke about, I worked in a community that had, 3 reservations right around us. And 2 of those were PL 280, meaning that they had concurrent jurisdiction with the state government. But the other never was a non-PL 280. And so it was dealing with the federal government. And it entered into so many complexities right in that small, like 6-7 county area, about about the quality response that you were going to get depending on where your assault happened, as well as even having to just navigate that as an advocate was confusing, let alone for survivors who aren't dealing with sexual assault day in and day out, right? And I think that we also have to kind of remember that that's across the country, and that's including the folks who might not have, a lot of the smaller tribes don't have land, or a lot of the tribes out east don't have land. And so how are we really kind of being attuned to the sovereign needs of a nation, and while also, making sure that we're paying attention to what survivors are really needing in that moment. And so, yeah. So that's just kind of the little baseline that we kind of wanted to lay, that there's a lot of kind of complications and a lot of issues that we're really needing. And when it comes down to it, I mean, we all bring our different forms of identity into space. We bring our family of origin, we bring our families of choice, we bring our sexuality, our education, our everything into who we are. And that's what every survivors you're going to be working with is going to be bringing, right? And let alone adding the beautiful complexities of being Indigenous, right? So, all right. So Shayla, you've lived on both tribal areas and in rural areas. What have you seen as common issues or misconceptions that happen when working with non-Native service providers? Like what issues have they said that they felt in working with Native survivors?
No, some of the issues, working in an urban community, we did have surrounding reservations. And when working with shelter services, medical providers, one thing that we would run into a lot would be the misconception of the survivor not having a home or life away from the reservation. So them assuming they were from the reservation and kind of not so much turning them away, but just kind of circling them back to the reservation, even though, we're there to utilize their services and utilize their help. But a lot of times we would run into them kind of not necessarily turning them away, but having them circling back to the reservation for resources and for help a lot of the times. And we would also run into a lot of assuming a tribal affiliation or assuming their tribal beliefs by the assumption of the tribe that other workers would assume that they were. And also, we talked about jurisdictional issues, and when, a lot of times when we would be trying to make reports or work with police, whether it was for protection orders or making a report, a lot of times we would, that jurisdiction piece, they would say, well, did you call tribal police? Did you go to the tribe? And it's like, no, it happened off the reservation. And it was like, oh, okay, well, you still have to work with tribal police. And it said, no, it's off the reservation, but still having the legal help put you in tribal jurisdiction, when really that's not the case at all. And one of the close reservations were checkerboarded, so it was a sovereign nation, but at the same time too, it was also the state of Montana, Polson, Montana. And it got really difficult when really trying to work with a survivor, and it was all that bouncing back and forth, like, well, did you talk to the tribal courts? Did you talk to, and it's like, no, well, she doesn't live on the reservation. She is not an enrolled member. Yes, she is Indigenous, but the blood quantum issue that we talked about, some enrolled members, when you are enrolled, you do get access to services. And if you aren't, it's kind of tougher to get access to those. And so really educating on that enrollment piece as well. And then also just getting bounced back and forth from reservation, from the urban resources. So really just trying to communicate as clear as you can to get I don't want to say the right support, but to effectively get.
Well, and I think what's hard with that is this idea where there's some folks who are doing that because they want to, provide the most, like, they feel that in order to provide culturally competent services, they should be referring back, right, to tribal folk, right? Which is great. We want to be uplifting. We want to be providing a multitude of options for folks, right? But sometimes it can come off as no one's wanting to take ownership, or no one's really wanting to kind of be the one to have to provide the help because people are already tapped. So it's like, oh, we have this many things going on already. Why don't we just let, the tribes deal with all the Native survivors? And, we've seen and heard this happen, right? And some of it's malicious and some of it's not, right? And so I think that's one of the things is really trying to be in good communication, for one thing, with the survivor about what they're wanting, what they're needing. I've seen people stressing out about how they're able to, help a survivor with, being able to smudge or, other smaller forms of, like, ceremony or culture, but they never asked the survivor if they wanted that. And the survivor's like, no, that's not really my jam, or, I can do that at home. I'm okay in this space. But people will get kind of weird about that. And they're wanting to kind of overcompensate. And I think that that's when it takes away the humanness, because a lot of what we talk about in Native communities is really doing relative to relative work, right? And I think that when people get weird, it inherently creates an even stronger like division between folks, right? And I don't know, I just kind of want us to be able to like sit down and just be with be with survivors and be in good relationship. And the thing is, like, there's no way for any of us, native, non-native, to know all of the different tribal customs, traditions, dance, slang, all of that kind of stuff. You can't know it all. But what you can do is, as I said earlier, be curious. And I will say that I know this is maybe controversial for some folks, but I think it's okay to ask. I think there's that while we all have to be doing our own work on things, particularly, hey, if you're working with, you're working at a mainstream program who works very closely with a tribal program, take somebody out for coffee and just have a conversation. And you can ask some of those questions like, hey, we've been noticing this a lot with the survivors that are coming through our door. What do you see? And what do you think we could be doing better? Right. And so coming at people with humility and love is going to be the best way. And I think that one of the other things that I've also seen, which is kind of along with that, is folks don't know the basics sometimes. And this is even people who have, I grew up in northern Minnesota, which has many reservations, many native people. But a lot of people there don't know the bare minimum. And even when I was an advocate, I was working with a SAAM nurse from the local IHS. And, I'd worked alongside her, done sexual assault response team work, all these sorts of things. Been at the advocate while she was doing SAAM exams over and over and over again. And for one thing, I'd found out after about 9 months that she didn't realize that we weren't on the same team, that advocates had privilege within Minnesota, and that I could not share with her, those individual things that survivors were telling me. But also, like, she didn't know what boarding schools were. And to me, especially in a community like that, especially when you are literally working on the reservation, to not know that level of what's really happening, like in the helpful way that's going to be impacting every single person that's coming through your door. I think that we both need to do our own work. Training, though, cannot make you culturally competent, right? So I've seen people be like, yeah, I attended this like amazing half-day training on, how to be culturally competent, and now I'm really good. And it seems like people think there's like a certification to be able to work with Native communities, but that's not it. It's more checking biases and really being open. And I think that's, the same with working with any sort of community, right? Like, there's a million communities that I'm not a part of, right? And I can't know all the things, but I think that, I don't know, that just sometimes folks get these misconceptions or these ideas about what it means to be Indigenous, or how Indigenous people in your community or across the world, act. And that's even simple things like, when I was in college, I was in Chicago and I'd meet all these new friends, and it would come out that I'm Native, and people would be like, oh, so how much do you get per year? Assuming that everybody who's Native gets some sort of per cap or check from their tribe, or that we all have mineral rights, or all these different things. There are some tribes out there that are incredibly wealthy and have a lot of access to money, right? There's also tribes that are incredibly poor. And it seems like some people think that, it's all or nothing. There's some people who think that, Indigenous people aren't educated. Like, I've been in so many spaces where people just assume that people barely graduated high school, if that, right? And you know what? If that's what people did, that's okay. It's also a growing number of Indigenous people who are educated and doing amazing work within their communities and beyond, in so many different realms. And so I think that just trying to break some of those like misconceptions that are out there. I've also even talking on a smaller level. I'm thinking about a lot of like meetings, that I've been to, and I've heard people afterwards, say like, hey, we invited the tribal program, but they just sat there and didn't say anything, right? And that could mean many things, right? Once again, people are not all the same. Maybe that person was not having a good day and they just didn't want to say anything. But also in many of the tribal communities that I have been in, there's a level of humility or waiting to speak, or waiting to be asked to speak and to share your views, especially if you're stepping into a space that's not really your own. I've also, in some of the spaces, I've been like, well, do they know why they're even here? And that kind of comes into tokenizing, because sometimes folks will be having these like ongoing meetings that have been going on for years and all these kind of relationships. And they're like, oh no, we don't have a tribal representative. So they invite the advocate, you know, in, and they don't really kind of like lay the groundwork or really make them feel welcome into what's happening. I was working in a very large city one time with a SART and a sexual assault response team. And I was talking to the representative of the Native agency there, and she's like, I've been on this team for 9 months and never once has anybody told me what our purpose is or what we're trying to do. She kind of kept showing up, but kind of not really. And so then people were like, oh, you know, that program's not interested. They don't want to put in the work. And so then it becomes kind of cyclical in your thinking, right? About how people aren't wanting to talk or aren't wanting to do things. I've also been in meetings where, you know, there's, I've seen it so often where there's a Native advocate who is fiery and fired up about something that's going on. And all of a sudden she is being, you know, termed as being, you know, a disruptor or somebody who is difficult to work with, right? When in fact, she's advocating for the very things that she needs to be advocating for within this space, right? And how so it seems like whether or not, you know, our Indigenous people within meetings are quiet or loud, we're doing something wrong, right? And we can never quite fit in. And so there's always this feeling of like a little bit of outsiderness, right? Or even how in so many meetings, things are just straight to the point, and how we have a strict timeline, we have a strict frame, and we have this wave that we're having to act with each other, when in fact, a lot of the times within meetings, within Native organizations, within Native communities, we have spaciousness, right? We have spaciousness to allow our values to be embedded and to come out. We have spaciousness to allow our kids to be running around and to be interrupting us, right? We have an agenda that's flexible to really meet the needs of what has to be done. And that's not saying that Indigenous communities are operating willy-nilly or that, you know, we don't get our work done. But sometimes we do it in a slightly different way, right? And I think, I mean, I'm going to even name, I came from some wonderful, but wonderful organizations that were non-Native. And coming from there to this current environment, it's really opening my eyes up to the ways that I've been systemized, that what people can phrase as the, you know, the white supremacy within the workplace really does come out in the way that I kind of act, in the way that I kind of feel about how certain things should be done, right? And how are we checking our own biases and expectations within spaces? Add on to that, Shayla, while I drink coffee.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say something and I had it pulled up. When providing advocacy, and I know we touched on those misconceptions, those common misconceptions of Indigenous folks, and really that trauma-informed piece, when victim blaming comes into place, you know, and a lot of those negative stereotypes, like, well, was she drinking? Are you sure she's just not out using drugs? Are you sure she's, and really just having that respect of, you know, treating them like a person, you know, they matter. And whether it's when you're working with law enforcement or medical help or any other type of service, and really being that voice to stop that harm. Like, no, she is not drunk. Can you please listen to her statement? Or no, she's just very upset. Of course, she's scared. She's frightened for her life. Yeah. No, she is not high off of meth right now. So really just advocating for, you know, that harmful victim blaming, or really educating about those negative stereotypes that come into play a lot of the time when we are offering our services or when we are working with survivors.
Right. I'm thinking about one time when I was an advocate and I went to the hospital and I thought I was there for, to do hospital accompaniment for like one survivor. And I show up and there's actually two people there, in separate rooms, different instances that happened. And they just hadn't called me for the second one yet. One person was Native, one was non-Native. They were both about the same age, early 20s, and both had been out partying and they were both sexually assaulted. But that night will always stand out because there was such a stark difference in how the Native survivor was treated versus how the white survivor was treated. And it was just like, there was this level of like, a lot more empathy was given towards the white survivor. And so the Native woman, she asked for the same kind of pain pills that the white survivor had, but was told, no, we can't provide that, or we can provide one pill, but you have to go to your primary. And it was very much insinuated that she was drug seeking in that moment, because what people really want to do is fake a sexual assault to then go get some drugs from the ER, right? And just like the way that people were talking, it was just so fascinating. And so, I mean, heartbreaking and frustrating. And we did everything we could. And then I did what I could in the moment to meet the needs of both survivors. And then taking afterwards, really trying to do some solid systems change work. And so talking about how are we better able to be training folks within, you know, the ER? How are we better able to name this? And what are those different strategies that we can employ when this happens in the future? But that was just one of those nights where I'm like, people were trying to say that, you know, there is no difference. We don't see color. And it was very obvious that night that people did. And I think that, you know, with that, there's also this, these problematic policies that happen, right? Kind of very much along with that. Like I was working at a different location or a different space, and I was very much told like, hey, you know, we, for safety reasons, we don't go to people's houses and we don't drive people, right? Which is a very valid, you know, rule that a lot of different programs have, right? But then once I was working there for a little bit longer, I kind of got like pulled aside and got a little whisper that was like, you know what, like, you know, in general, we don't drive people, but you know, the only place, like the one place that you really can't do it is to the res. So if you're just driving people around here in town, that's okay, but you can't go out to the res. And I'm like, oh, this is a racist policy, like when it comes down to it. And I'm like, the fact that whenever you have to whisper certain things, I think that you should question whether or not you should be having those beliefs, right? I was talking with another colleague about who worked at, you know, it was like a dual multi-service agency where they did both domestic violence and sexual assault. And so they'd be having like a lot of people kind of coming into like this house sort of setting. And, you know, they had a rule about lice checks that was only actually implemented on Native survivors. So every Native survivor that would come through would have to have a lice check done, but the non-Native survivors didn't have to. And so these policies exist, and these are not like long time ago sorts of things, right? You know, these are like those day-to-day things that are, I don't even, you can label them as microaggressions. It's probably things that people thought were correct. And then, you know, new advocates were trained in on that same way. And then all of a sudden you have this culture where people get very judgmental about advocates, like, oh, or about Native survivors, where it's like, oh, often I hear like people never want to follow up for services, right? You know, or people change their phone number so often that we can't ever keep track of them, right? And so it's like, okay, so what can we do with this, right? And so, yeah, it may be true that some folks can't keep a stable phone line, right? Do you have money that you can give them so that they could, you know, keep the same phone number for a while? That's one option. Like, let's talk about not having a menu of services and actually being able to give people what they need, right? If that is something that's going to be helping them get access to healing and justice, find a few $100s and be able to get them some money for a phone, right? Or go about it some other sorts of ways, like collect a couple of different phone numbers, a place where you can always like leave that safe kind of voicemail. I've also heard, you know, people who only want survivors to contact them because they don't want to force advocacy on somebody, right? And I understand that framework, but there's also some people where it's like, life is so busy and you are so stressed out about this or that. And when like you barely have time to be thinking. And so when someone is able to call you up and be like, hey, I just wanted to check in on you, that may be exactly what they need. And so maybe that's what you need to be considered within your community, is having more advocate initiated, you know, communication with survivors to really kind of foster that relationship, especially if somebody's missed a few appointments, right? Like, maybe they're ashamed, maybe they think you're angry at them, maybe all the things, right? And so really be thinking about how can we, like, even those small sorts of ways, how are we providing transportation, and how are we providing childcare? Are people allowed to bring their kids with to like an advocacy appointment? Maybe it's not ideal all the time because you want someone to be able to take a few minutes to focus on themselves, right? But maybe that's the only way that they're going to be able to, is either if you provide childcare or let their kid run around your office for 30 minutes, right? Maybe that's what you need to be doing. And really, I think looking at, this is kind of segue into like the next bit, which is really like, what can we do as individuals? And what can programs do? I think that looking at your policies, first of all, looking at them through a values-driven lens for one thing, right? 'Cause so many of our policies are written, they're written in a couple ways. One is truly like you're trying to check the boxes on HR and legal sorts of things, right? Other places get policies that kind of have become like, they're what I call like the bad domestic violence shelter policies, where something happened one time, so you make a rule and that's how things are really formed. And I don't think that's how we should be doing things. I think that every program every few years needs to just take a pause and look through all of their documents, including the way that they hire. And I think there's so many programs who don't feel like, based on hiring practices or interview practices, are making things where they're not accessible to native advocates to be able to get a foothold in a program. Or they also sometimes, I've seen places where they think that, oh, a native advocate can only serve native survivors, right? And I'm like, that's also not the thing. Or you get so tokenized, or you're like that specialist. And it's like, yeah, that can be great, because even coming from the Garden of Truth report, which was done about 11 years ago, interviewing 105 women in trafficking, in sex worker trafficking here in Minnesota, you know, the big thing was they wanted a native survivor or a native advocate to be able to connect with, right? And so even more than a lot of communities, like native people are attractive to native people, right? Like where you feel comfort, you feel this natural sense of knowing. But at the same point, people should be able to help, you know, native survivors as well. And native survivors should be able to help anybody. And I think that people kind of get like, you get kind of so pointed, where it gets to the point where in meetings, all of a sudden people, like you say the word native and people will turn to you as the advocate, and how your views that aren't also respected in other kinds of settings, because people think all you know is tribal, right? And so I think that there's a bunch of different things like within our hiring processes, like thinking about like, what are your, I mean, there's some programs that are still requiring having like a master's degree for like an advocacy level job. And really thinking about like, what are we asking in terms of education, in terms of flexibility. I've seen programs where you're required to still be on call, you know, how like, you know, 20 hours a month that you're having to be on call, which can be really prohibitive to some people. And I understand that people need to make their organizations work how they need it to work, but really thinking, what are those barriers? And if you know what, if you've hired a couple of native advocates over the years and they haven't lasted, are you doing good exit interviews? Are you talking about why this isn't the right fit, right? And are you also making spaces where it's actually safe to be honest, even in those moments, where you're able to kind of have people advocate for their own needs? So, Shayla, what else do you think individuals or programs can do?
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were just talking about, and really like the being a good relative and talking to each other, and especially those creating that safe space and those dynamics. You know, we talked about being an advocate and, you know, definitely being that voice for when someone is in crisis, but then at the same time too, also encouraging the other, just trying to think of how I could put this. When we're working with other entities, whether it's law enforcement organizations, and really fostering that communication dynamic, you know, like you being the advocate and maybe they're just strictly talking and looking at you and totally ignoring or not even acknowledging the survivor in the room, when really that's who we're all working for. And really just trying to encourage them, like, can you please communicate with the survivor instead of, sorry, no, I'm going to come back to it. Hold on one second.
Perfect. And one of the things I did want to mention is that really this isn't optional. I think that in order to do our jobs right, being able to work with folks of any kind of culture is important. And while we want to uplift and support culturally specific programming, whatever it is, people still need to do their job, right? And also, when we're talking about some of these policies that are so problematic that you can't even call them microaggressions, they're full on creating systems that are doing harm and replicating really destructive forces. within most programs are receiving federal funding, and within almost all federal funding, there are things that you can't do. That you can't be discriminating against people because of race, because of gender, all these sorts of things. And so honestly, as programs, we have the responsibility to maintain our funding, for one thing, but to be really doing the best we can. And also when we see another, like a sister program or another program in another community causing this harm, like to help them make those changes. And if they're not willing to really, you might need to be escalating things. And I think sometimes we worry about rocking the boat, but at the same point, like if programs are like advocacy is an amazing and a beautiful kind of thing. And this is also for like all sorts of service provision as well. And so, I've worked with a lot of mental health people and a lot of folks who are in case management and things like that. And it's all pretty similar when it comes down to it, that we've been doing the same things for so long, and we need to be making changes. We can't keep replicating these systems and these ways of being. And especially, after the pandemic, I feel that we should have taken that as an opportunity to really like start fresh and to try new and to be super curious. And I think that sometimes it's so easy to just fall back into the old ways. Oh, we've done the same event the same way for the past 20 years. This is just what we do, right? But not really thinking about, okay, so who's attending your things? Why is if your population of your community is, 10% Native American, are you not seeing anybody showing up at your events, right? Did you remember what you're going to say, Shayla?
Almost.
All right, well, I'm going to keep rambling. And so also when it comes to funding, one of the things that I really just want to call out to people is that it is so important to work with, if be it a tribal community or be a tribal program, or be it, the culture civic program in your community, all these sorts of things. It's so important to have those connections, right? And people cannot keep writing grants and then kind of bringing in the tribal program like last minute, right? Honestly, we see that here as a tribal coalition all the time. People have these good ideas and like, we want to work with tribal communities. They don't ask us anything. And then at the last minute, they'll be like, hey, do you want to be our partner and work on this, right? And it's not genuine. I mean, it may be coming from a good place and a good intention, but to have genuine collaboration is where true change will happen. Not just having us come in and act as, the token Indian voice or whatever it may be. And it's so important to not do that. And also on the same point, pay people. I think that if this is important to remember, like even for folks who are coming in, like even non-tribal programs who bring people in to do like a traditional prayer or a drum circle, things like that, make sure you're paying those people, and as well as gifting them things, right? That is so important. And also pay, if you're having the local advocacy program come in to do some sort of training for your program, pay them. And I know that some people will have it, within their grants and things like that. But honestly, for one thing, all of our movement is underpaid, right? But when you're talking about the emotional weight that comes with having to always be talking about your culture and having to try to like bring people along to make you feel that you're like to even recognize your humanity or the fact that you exist in some places, give people the money, like put your money where the mouth is, and really just make sure that that's happening.
And then one thing I was thinking of too, even individuals and people working in the movement, advocates, or even community members, everyone, always I don't want to say monitor, but check our biases, right? Especially when it comes to sexual violence or even, just anything, making sure that in communities and whatever space we're working in, that we're always checking our biases, that we're not assuming, or that we're not working from assumptions, from not having a clear understanding.
And that's the thing. I think that's a very human thing, right? Like we all come into spaces with assumptions, right? We've been shown the world works in different ways. And sometimes we have, like, even this last weekend, I had to check some of my own biases, right? I work at a theater, and I was a little frustrated that we weren't going to be that the show wasn't going to be starting when the advertised time was. And people are like, with this community, it's expected that things will start 30 minutes later, right? And I had to check that, because it's also like, I know, like within our Native communities, people will always make that joke, which is both true and problematic at the same time, about Indian time, right? Where we're always running a little bit late, or we're very flexible with, you know, when we show up to meetings and things like that, right? And it's true and harmful at the same time, right? But I had to remember, like, and even though I knew that like this is what works best for that community, I'm like, but why did you say you're going to start at this time when you weren't going to start at this time? And I was having to check myself. And I think that even in that kind of like small sort of way, we need to be doing that all the time, like taking that step back and being like, oh, where is this coming from within myself, right? And that's in working with so many different like communities. And also always with that same point, remembering that there's so much intersectionality within our communities, right? There are so many people who are Afro-Indigenous. There are so many people who are Asian Indigenous, you know, all these different things, people who are Native and have disabilities, right? All these different sorts of things that you can't just compartmentalize them down to like one single box, right? And we're having to, and maybe at certain points, you know, one part of their identity is needing more attention than the other. And we also cannot, as service providers, be making those assumptions or putting things on somebody. And yeah, kind of with that, it's that stepping back when it's appropriate. I think that there's times where you need, like, even because I am not enrolled, I'm also incredibly light-skinned. There's times where I need to step back, right? I need to be able to let certain people have, like, be on the stage and be that front-facing voice, right? You know, it is not my place. I have not felt the same colorism. I have not felt those sorts of things that some people have felt, right? And so I need to step back and let other people spearhead certain things, right? There's also times where as individuals, we also need to be stepping forward, even if it's not things that are directly impacting us, right? So advocates who are seeing racism happening in their community, you need to be stepping forward and talking about that, even if it's not being directed at you. Work in conjunction with families and communities and all of that. But as Native people, we cannot always be the ones who are crying for ourselves, or crying out that we need to be listened to, that we need to be respected, and that we're here, right? That's one of the other things that came from the Garden of Truth report, that, I mean, I first heard our executive director talk about it like probably 8-9 years ago now. And it was John was saying to somebody who'd been trafficked, you know, I thought we killed all of you. And that is just still, it's stuck with me since then. And it's still just such a problematic phrase, is that people really do seem to forget, like, well, yes, in some border communities, places where there's a lot of like reservations around, you don't forget, but the vast majority of the country seems to think that we are something else, that we are statistically insignificant in so many things that we're not even reported upon in most spaces, right? Even a lot of the surveys and studies out there about sexual assault in general don't specify us, right? We are barely even numbers. And so how are you doing things within your own community? How are you making sure, like, what boxes are people able to check when they are coming into your program? All of those sorts of things. And this is beyond, like, I remember I left a job one time, and a few months later, you know, the new executive director was really trying to like do this big push on, you know, outreach to Native communities. And so she sent me, she's like, hey, Jolene, can you just, I know you're not working here, but can you just take a look at this and see if this is, you know, a good culturally appropriate brochure? And all it was their regular brochure, but with a lot of red colors and a lot of feathers on it. And for her, that was it being culturally appropriate. And we need to recognize that it's not just outward aesthetics of, you know, being Native. Like, yeah, there's different things that are going to like be important to like have in design work, right? You know, that's always good. But at the same point, it's more than that. It's the content, and it's the fact, and it's whether or not you are actually living up to that. I was working with a different program who they were so focused on having their entire website translated into Spanish, right? They wanted it into Spanish, and they were so set on it because they wanted to be accessible to the community, but they didn't have any advocates on staff who spoke Spanish. And so they were creating this space, but they weren't able to actually live out what they were kind of promising to people. And we don't want that. We want survivors to expect integrity from anybody, any door that they walk through. And so making sure that if you are promised, if you're saying that you are able to do these things, and if you are showing up in those environments, like you're showing up to the MIW marches and all that, those sorts of things, but are you actually living this out? Are you calling out, law enforcement when there's problematic things happening within your community? Are you showing up to do the mutual aid that so many programs are doing? Are you doing on the ground work, doing searches for people when they go missing? How are you really living out what you're saying and not just having optics of being culturally competent? So we're kind of coming towards our end here. And Shayla, any kind of not final thoughts, because this is a conversation that needs to go, or that needs to keep growing. And I hope that we've been able to kind of like throw out a few little ideas for people, as well as really help to underscore like the importance of this. But Shayla, what's on your head? Mind, not head.
No, I'm really grateful and happy Jolene invited me to speak with you all. Sexual violence, it's been around for a long time, but the services, the response, the misconceptions, the victim blaming, we still have a long way to go. And I feel like these spaces are just amazing because it's like a safe space where we get to talk, we get to learn, we get to encourage each other, we get to working in this movement isn't easy. So really supporting each other and showing up for each other and not just educating, but also like supporting each other's emotional weight. A lot of this movement, being an advocate and taking care of yourself. We self-care is so important, but like really do we take time for ourselves? So I'm just thank you for letting me speak and share with you all. I'm really grateful for these spaces because I feel like they're really needed and, just great conversation, right? To learn from each other and definitely be a good relative to everyone as well.
Thank you for that, Shayla. And kind of as we come to a close, there's a few, like, I want to just once again reiterate, be curious. Like that, if we can do anything in the world, we should all be constantly learning and constantly wanting to grow and expand. So be curious and be communicative, talk with folks. I feel that there's so many communities out there where there are these long-standing rubs, things that happened 25, 30 years ago between different organizations, or things that happened 15 years ago when funding got competitive and they started to have to like fight with each other, that are still impacting the way that, employees, at different organizations work with each other. But really, how is that impacting survivors? So if we could do away with that ego, and especially when you're adding in, if it's a tribal program and a mainstream program, like how are we best able to really put our things aside and do the work that we need to be doing. I also wanted to kind of as a final thing, just also name the fact that there's a lot of things like when you're looking at like risk factors of sexual violence and things like that, or sex trafficking. And a lot of those risk factors are very, very common and in high numbers within our Indigenous community, right? Like you're talking ACEs, like ACE scores, and things like that. And a lot of people in our community, they are going to be not off the charts, but they're going to be very high on all these things. And it gets to the point where sometimes, like, if you look at things, you're like, oh, so is simply being, Native and being alive a risk factor, right? And it can be, but at the same time, we are hilarious, we are beautiful, we are funny, we are resilient, some people are really annoying, all these sorts of things. We are whole human beings. And I feel that there's been a lot of like kind of shame or pity, like, oh, we have to help, all these people. And it's like, yes, and we are amazing and can do things too, right? And so how are we kind of coupling that wholeness of people? And so at the end of the day, this is like a short hour of us just talking, and, there is no point where somebody is magically, like culturally competent. But there's always a place to learn. And I do hope that you're able to take a little bit and that we can build these relationships. We, as MIWSAC, will also be starting through a different funding stream, our 40-hour advocacy training that is, tribally designed and tribally specific. The information about that can be found on our Facebook page or on our website, where even if you've been trained as an advocate, maybe try to learn a little bit or pop in on a few sessions, kind of hear things that are, really true for our Indigenous communities. Also reach out. We are trying to work with communities and figure out how can we do this better and how can we create some tangible tools that can be replicated to enhance that capacity of programs. And so we want to form these relationships. And so just miigwech for being with us today. And thank you to Hercules and Amber, our interpreters. And thank you again, Shayla, for being with us. And thank you to HHS and OFIPS for the funding to allow us to really explore these unique needs in tribal communities. So thank you. Thank you all.
Get to tell me and thank you.